Sheila, it's lovely to welcome you to the Castle of the Muses here. Okay, and I know
Pleasure to meet you.
Great, I know you've come a long way.
And learn more about the Institute, which is doing a great job.
Thank you. And you come all the way from Lebanon, from Beirut, to be with us.
That's true. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but you're originally from Armenian origin.
Descent, yes.
Yeah. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to ask you a few questions, if that's okay.
Please go ahead.
Firstly, about your Armenian roots and you know what the Armenian people went through, because you carry that knowledge, and it's often left out. And because I'm chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, I think the Armenian voice is important in the whole Middle East. There are Armenians in many Middle Eastern countries.
True.
When I was in Bethlehem a few years ago, we interviewed an Armenian who lives in Palestine, and he was identifying as a minority, you know, with the Palestinians. He was a Christian. So I'll ask you a few questions about your Armenian origin and so on. And then we'll come on and look at contemporary Lebanon and what it's like to live there. And,
sure.
You know, that's a Middle Eastern country that so far, thanks be to God, is at peace, right, now. Whereas its neighbour Syria is falling apart as we speak. So I'll ask your questions really from a peace perspective. And I'm interviewing you as a peace academic, yeah, as a peace scholar, interested in how cultures can live in harmony together.
Precisely.
And as a philosopher, yeah. Okay, so the first question I've got is really, I'm interested in your father's life and history. Tell me about him, his name, date of birth and so on.
Well, his name was Sheila Abdalian. He was born in Gürin, present Turkey, in 1909. And he was one of the survivors of the Armenian Genocide. And he's a well-known poet, publisher, editor, literary critic, and public figure who helped a lot the Armenians in Lebanon as well as in the diaspora.
So he survived the Armenian Genocide by what? By a long march? Did they go to Lebanon or what?
Well, they started from their birthplace, which was Gürin, and they had to march all the way the Syrian desert, and out of the family of 11, 4 survived. And then he reached to Syria. He had part of his education there. Then he moved from Syria. He had to go to Lebanon. He did his BS degree in engineering in the American University, and he taught at the British High School. He was the chief mathematician and science teacher.
In Lebanon? Right.
And then he was called to go to Cyprus. We have a very well-known institute, the Melkonian Institute, and he taught there. Then he came back to Lebanon. He was assigned to be principal and teacher. And he started his own literary and art magazine, which was called Ani. Aside doing translations and printing on his own poems, as well as correcting, editing other writers' works.
So he was fluent in Armenian, Arabic and English?
French as well.
So 4 main languages? Yeah. So a typical sort of Oriental literary figure. I mean, that's one of the things I love about the Orient, is people are multilingual. And you're brought up like that, aren't you? What languages do you speak?
The 4 languages, Arabic, English, French and Armenian.
Okay, so thanks for doing this interview in English.
Welcome.
I could do it in French, but we'll stick with the English. So tell me about your father's parents and his ancestors then. And what were they doing in that march? How did they get there?
Well, at the beginning they were asked that they are being displaced. They thought that eventually they're going to reach somewhere, and they didn't know that it was leading to their death, to starvation and hunger. So they had to leave all their belongings, all their wealth behind. And they were well-off people.
In this town called Gürin?
Yes.
Yeah. And what were their names, his parents?
Hagop and Azniv Abdalian.
Right. And they were just a normal couple with a family of...
Yes. With 9 kids.
9 kids. And they all had to march in the desert?
Yeah. I mean, there was a baby, a few months old, because the mother, she was malnourished. He died on the road. I had another aunt who, afraid of being raped, she had thrown herself into the river. And the rest, some were taken because men were separated from women in the march. Women and children were together. The men had been taken in others. So we don't have details what happened to those.
They were killed somewhere else. Yeah. I mean, most people really don't know much about the Armenian genocide. It's been kind of wiped out of
Though
history.
there had been, according to reports, there had been journalists, mainly German, who had taken some pictures, and then this is how we have some given facts through foreign mission people.
Right, so it was documented as factual. Yeah. So what year was this happening?
1915.
So it's during what we call World War One.
Exactly.
Do you use the same terminology in Armenian? You talk about World War One. Yeah. And so what happened? Just tell people that have never heard of this thing, roughly.
Well, the way that it has been said is that Turkey, thinking that because Armenia, the strategic situation, it had one neighbor was Turkey, one Russia, and the other Iran, Azerbaijan. So they had thought that Armenians, being close to Russia, they were preparing something against them, whereas it wasn't true at all. And they were afraid. They were seeing how skillful traders the Armenians were. They thought of exterminating a powerful source next to them. So they started the genocide by exterminating first the very intellectual people, the journalists. They were
Armenians,
killed, and then they went by taking away the men away, and eventually the women and the kids, so that the number, in their mind, they wanted to not leave a single Armenian on earth. But that didn't happen.
So it was literally an attempt to wipe out a whole people. I mean, that is shocking, obviously, for people. And in the consciousness of Britain and France and other countries, we think of World War One as something happening on the trenches. And if you think about the Middle East, you'll think about Lawrence of Arabia and the desert, and Gallipoli when British and Australian troops tried to break through the Ottoman lines. But we're not taught much about the Armenian,
That's why it has
story.
been referred to as the Forgotten Genocide, because unlike the Holocaust for the Jews, later on they tried to get back their rights and they had a voice, whereas in case of the Armenian Genocide, nowadays even Turkey denies the acceptance that it has even occurred, and some other powers who are in good diplomatic relations with Turkey, in order to be friendly with them, they also side. I mean, they don't deny it, but they don't even, on the other hand, they don't claim that it has happened and we have to get justice to get back our lands.
So there's been never an offer of compensation to the survivors, the victims, such as your father indirectly. You're a displaced person. You should be living in Turkey.
That's why
with your
you see so many Armenians dispersed all around the world. I mean, first of all, the bulk arrived to Syria. From Syria, the closest location had been Lebanon. But then eventually, through the years, we have been dispersed all around the world, from Europe, Canada, the States, Australia, all over.
Right, and the original Armenian people come from an old ancient ancestry. Tell me about...
Armenians have been traced back to the Stone Age, and the name we call ourselves in Armenian Hai. That came from our first hero called Haik. And when others refer us as Armenians, that's the grandson of Haik, whose name was Aram. Now the Hittites that lived at that period, they used to call us Armeni. So again, that's the reference how the word Armenians came.
Right, and you're an Indo-European speaking people.
We belong to the Indo-European. Yes.
So you'd be one of the bridge-building peoples of Anatolia between the West European, Balkan regions, and then over to India. So if anyone was going to retrace the whole history of the Indo-Europeans, your language is important, isn't it?
Very important.
Yeah.
And the culture we share.
Right. And you had an ancient, I mean, I'm, as you know, a religious studies scholar, so I'm interested in ancient Armenian religion, for instance.
We were pagan at the beginning.
Right.
Zoroastrianism used to be our religion. Till in 301, we were one of the first nation to become Christian through Gregory the Illuminator, who played a big role.
Right. He was a teacher and a spiritual guide, wasn't he, from Palestine, in fact.
And henceforth, in order for us to keep our Christianity, we had a lot of people who died in the name of religion.
Because you were, the Persians tried to conquer you, didn't they?
There were the Persians, the Romans, and the Crusaders. All these movements led to a lot of losses in our numbers.
Right, and so let's just go back briefly to your mother's family, and tell me about your mother's life and history.
Well, my mother, her name was Anahit Topchian, and she was born in 1912.
Right.
And her dad, Dr. Hagop Topchian, he was a philosopher, and he was a journalist working for the German newspaper. As well as tradesman, he was a fur seller. They lived for some time in Constantinople, present Turkey, and then they moved between Cyprus and France.
So sort of Armenian intelligentsia.
Exactly, because the Armenians that usually come from Constantinople, they formed the intellectuals.
And so your mother was brought up in France partly and Constantinople.
Cyprus, and then they moved to Lebanon.
Right. When did she move to Lebanon?
40s.
Okay. Later.
Late 40s.
Right. And when did she meet your mother then? I mean your father, sorry.
Well, they knew each other through family ties. My grandparents were the godfather and godmother to my father's first marriage. That's how they had met. Then my father's first wife, when she died, he got married with my mom.
So the sort of family ties going right back. Right. Fascinating. But on her side, there wasn't any history of the Armenian genocide.
No, they didn't go through losses.
They survived.
They survived.
Yeah.
I mean, those living in Constantinople were not persecuted as much, except the intellectual people who were on purpose, deliberately executed.
I find that rather interesting and sad that when I went to Auschwitz and studied the history of the Holocaust against the Jews, it was often the intellectuals that are rounded up first. When Poland was conquered, the Nazis also wanted to eradicate the Polish intellectuals, many of whom were Jewish. And when the Romans conquered ancient Britain, they, tried to kill all the Druids, who were like the intellectuals of Britain. It's an old story. If you want to oppress a people, wipe them out, you kill the thinkers first.
Dr. Daffern, that's why I really appreciate the work you're doing, because in my readings I'd seen somewhere that had the Armenian genocide been truthfully followed up, then Hitler wouldn't have gone ahead and done the Jewish Holocaust. Because when you know that you would be punished at the end, you would think twice before moving. And so it's important for us to talk about such subjects in order to avoid future cases of genocide.
Right, so what you're saying is, had the world's intellectuals and historians and so on really exposed what had happened.
Because it went in silence.
So instead there was a policy of silence, which I don't understand as a British Canadian dual citizen. I mean, I've nursed soldiers that fought in World War I, and they gave their lives for what they thought was a valid cause. And yet, so why be silent if the enemy was doing such, from the British and Canadian perspective, if such crimes were being committed? Why silence? I mean, this to me is incomprehensible. As a peace scholar,
but when you bear in mind always the strong people have allies. I mean, the European powers, they prefer to side with Turkey rather than Armenia. For them, Armenia didn't present any piece of cake.
Well, I don't know. There's another tradition in British diplomacy. Gladstone, who represented the liberal tradition in British politics, and he, thought this stuff through in the 19th century. He argued that British foreign policy should pursue an ethical course, And he made the strong link between ethics and foreign policy. He said, yes, there's naked power and so on, but you can't build a lasting civilization on that. Look what happened to Rome in the days of the corrupt emperors like Caligula. It all fell apart to sand, So Gladstone and that tradition argued that no, you have to have ethics as the basis of foreign policy. And I would agree with that insight.
I'm sure there were some who tried to do their best, but practically didn't help much. On individual cases, we have heard of stories where a lot of foreign mission people helped the Armenians. But on the general outcome, it didn't reflect, because 1.5 million to be killed and the world watching.
Well, I'm sure the British were trying to do their best. They were actually fighting the Turks at the time. Let's not forget that. They were trying to stop the Turks. They were fighting them. And with Lawrence of Arabia, they were working with the Arab, fighters to and eventually did conquer, large parts of Syria. They liberated Syria and Palestine. And, they would have done more if they could have got through sooner. General Allenby finally got to Jerusalem. But it was a horrible war. If it had been up to me, I would have prevented World War I happening. I do believe in intelligence. You could talk about the intellectuals' role in exposing genocide, I agree. But our primary role is to prevent it happening in the first place, which we can only do by preventing wars, isn't it? So that's our real job.
Resolution to conflicts, before they lead to wars.
Quite. So, and what was your mother's sort of family tree, as it were? Was she from a Constantinople family of Armenians?
Yes. My grandfather, he came from Aintab, which is a region, again, in preoccupied Turkey now.
Right. And in Jerusalem, there's a big Armenian presence. There's an Armenian quarter,
yeah, because some of them, they went to Jerusalem. Some got the Jewish passports, and others got Jordanian passports. So we have around 5,000 Armenians living there.
In Jerusalem.
Right. They have their church.
Yeah, no, I've been, and also in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There's a wonderful room.
I haven't been, can't tell you anything.
Yeah, no, it's very beautiful. I hope you get there someday. So, what you're saying is that it's important people understand about the Armenian genocide. There is an International Association for Genocide Studies, and I think that there are scholars working around the world. When I visited Auschwitz, I talked to the research director of that. They have a study centre in Auschwitz. The more scholars that look at this stuff dispassionately and objectively, and also passionately, as you say, to prevent it happening again. Do you know has anyone written a history of the Armenian genocide? Like a definitive?
Many have done, but still you don't have enough propaganda done about it.
Right. Do you know if there's any university centres in the
States, for instance, there is the Zorian Institute.
Right.
What they were trying to do to gain time and try to interview as many survivors as possible, so that they would tell the stories of their lives.
Okay, and have they done that?
Yeah, they did
right.
that.
Have they got a website? Have they got the interviews on? Yeah. Okay, that's because they must be just about dying off now. The last surviving witnesses.
Recently, I think one of the Armenian ladies in Britain, she had died.
I saw that, aged like 98. Yeah, that was fascinating. And there is this film that you brought to the castle here. Just tell us briefly about that film.
The Taviani brothers of Italy, based on the book of Antonio Arslan, they turned the Lark Farm to a movie. That's the story about a family going through a very rich, well-off family, going through the hardship of the genocide. And then it shows in the film, which is very good the way it's projected, how the Armenians and the Turks had good social relations together, and they lived in peace. And suddenly, when the Young Turks came up with the plan of dismantling the Armenians and leading them to deportation camps, all the image changed. But again, on individual basis, there had been many faithful Turks who had tried to help as much as they can families with whom they had good family relations.
I mean, as a philosopher, I've been asking myself, having seen that movie and, you know, kind of cried inwardly at what it portrays, whether it's nationalism that is at the root of these problems. Because in the old Ottoman Empire, there were these different millets, different protected peoples. The Armenians had their rights, they were allowed freedom of thought, you know, within a structure, as were the Jews and other groups. And the idea was the Sultan was the emir in charge of them all, you know, and would give justice. With the rise of nationalism, that system began to break down, and the Young Turks represented a much more fierce strain of, you know, Turkishness, which the Ottoman people, I think, in their heyday, were wiser than that. So the Young Turks, were they intellectually responsible for the genocide, do you think? Was it that Turkish nationalism?
I don't think so, because according to what I read, even some Armenians had very high posts in the government.
Right.
So they trusted the Armenians in order to put them at high posts.
Right.
So, as you're saying, it's more a matter of fanaticism or nationalism that led to that.
Have historians worked out who actually gave the orders? Who in the Ottoman regime actually sanctioned this?
Well,
does anyone know?
They give the names of Talat Basha, who was one of the headmasters of the Young Turks. But again, further details, further investigations haven't yet been done.
Okay. Well,
because all the papers that the Armenians need to write the history back again has been stopped from Turkish authorities to go through and investigate.
So they're in archives in Turkey, but
Supposedly.
Armenian scholars can't get access. Well, that's very interesting. You know, I mean, I can say on behalf of Historians for Peace, which is, you know, a project I run from the Institute here, that I will do what I can to uncover the facts around this. As a historian, you know, I have a PhD in intellectual history, and I studied the history of World War I at the University of London in depth with teachers who had lived through it, or, you know, so it's a subject of great interest to me, and I will do what I can. Next time you come back to the castle, you know, I'll have found out a lot more about this, and I'll try and get in touch with Armenian historians. Okay, let's move on a bit, and I'm interested just generally, tell me a bit about Armenian literature and poetry. Your father was a poet. How far back does it go?
Well, it goes quite back to the times when the Armenian alphabet was created. The first step soon after what they did was to write the history, and we owe this to a person called Movses Khorenatsi, who wrote down the literature.
Okay. Was he a Christian then?
Yes, he was.
Right. What sort of time is this then?
Around 400.
So pretty early.
Yeah.
And he wrote like a literary history of Armenia. Wow. Okay.
And another thing, we had like the bards, what we call ashuls. We had Sayat Nova who went from town to town, village to village, noting down the stories of the people. This also was necessary for us to trace back the history, how it was, how life went those days.
So there's an oral tradition in Armenian literature as well, of bards and
yes.
And yeah, every culture has
troubadours.
That, right? Yeah, fascinating. And okay, so the literature is very ancient. Who would you say, roughly, are the three greatest writers of Armenian literature? Like we would say Shakespeare and... You know.
Yeah. Well, I would nominate three mainly. One is Hovannes Tumanyan. He was a great literary figure, and he gave us lots of the fables, the legends, which are important also to have background history about Armenians, our traditions. Another one was Krikor Zohrab, who comes from Constantinople, and he was not only a writer, a public activist and a lawyer, and he had a good post in the Turkish...
Okay, 19th century or...?
And he was killed during those times.
During the genocide? He was one of the intellectuals killed?
Exactly.
Right. And the third one?
And the third one, I would say it's difficult to choose actually three because there are so many.
Are there women literary figures?
Yes, there is a lady called Zabelia Sayan, and she was ahead of her time, and she had brought the movement towards feminism, how to protect women's rights.
Okay, well maybe we could have her as a third. So, in the ancient Armenian religion, were there goddesses as well as gods?
Definitely.
The archetype of the females.
Definitely. There were Anahid and Vahakan and Aschid. These were the main gods and goddesses that they had, and they had dedicated a temple for them called Vahevahyan, and they used to go and worship those.
And where was that temple? In ancient Armenia?
In ancient Armenia. We're talking the Urartu period.
Very early, sort of yes. Alongside Babylon and Hittites.
Yeah. And then when it became Christians, those temples were converted to churches.
Right.
But still keeping the image of not destroying them.
Right. A bit like with the Druid sanctuaries, they converted them to Christian. Yeah, we kept the old traditions alive. Interesting. And so can you tell me a bit about the the understanding of the muse in Armenian? Here we are in the Castle of the Muses. Do you use the word muse, or do you have an Armenian equivalent? What is it that gives poets inspiration and philosophers inspiration?
Well, in our poetry, what really inspires us is mainly nationalism. So because we have gone through a lot of
so the muse of the country
to survive, yeah.
Right.
It's nationalistic, it's love, definitely, the theme of love,
right.
And nature.
The beauty of nature.
Yeah, beauty of nature.
So Armenia is quite a hilly, mountainous country, isn't it? A bit like Scotland here with the mountains.
Rocky.
You recognise the mountains, yeah? Right.
And there in their architecture they have a specific stone, the doof they call. They use it, which comes in a very different color. It's kind of pinkish.
From the mountains
From the
extracted,
mountains,
and they use it for building. Have you been to Armenia proper yourself?
Several times, around 9 times I've been there.
Okay, right. And what do you feel when you go back?
It's a very beautiful country.
Yeah.
Definitely it needs more efforts to become to be more acceptable for tourists, though lately after the Armenia became independent, more efforts have been done to make it more modernized and efforts to make it more business oriented. Because at the beginning, at the time of the communist Russia that Armenia was under, it had its own advantages that education and arts were kind of encouraged, but at the same time business capitalistic movements were not present there. So now it's going more towards
free market
privatization rather than the government being in charge of those things.
And that's going successfully. I mean, what's unemployment like in the economy generally in Armenia?
According to what I hear, each year it's getting better, and there are a lot of Armenians who reside in the States that they come and they do projects, either open factories or come up with residential complexes, bearing in mind that in their retirement periods they would like to come and settle in Armenia.
Right. It doesn't have, what's its main economic resources, Armenia? It doesn't have oil, does it? What has it got that it can trade with the rest of the world?
Well, mainly what it had, it was its tourism that it depended on, because people were interested to come to Armenia as one of the ancient cities to come and see.
Right. So it's cultural
importances. Mainly. Cultural, because we were very strong in our theater, in music, in the movies, in architecture. The architecture itself is a beauty to come and witness. There was a village called 1001 churches village. Imagine one village to have the access of 1001 Christian. Yeah.
And there were scientists also, weren't there? Armenian
Yeah,
scientists.
we had many scientists.
Because in the Soviet era, you were quite influential within the Soviet system, weren't you, as Armenians? Can you name me any of the famous?
Like there is Adam Migoyan, who was the one who invented the MiG plane.
Okay.
And we have some, like Alex Manukyan from the States. He had come up with the tap water tabbing system.
Okay.
And
right.
so many.
And Semyon Kurlian is one I'm particularly interested in.
Yes.
Who photographed the human aura doing sort of parapsychological research. He was a genius operating in the Soviet days, and I'm sure that Armenian intellectual history is very interesting in terms of its spiritual and scientific history. So Armenia proper has a problem with Azerbaijan, doesn't it? And Nagorno-Karabakh. Can you tell me about that?
There's an enclave that when Armenia got its independence, they wanted to join it to Armenia.
This is after the Soviet system collapsed.
Yes.
And then these separate countries, Azerbaijan and
But
Armenia
Azerbaijan they wanted to have access to that land, so there was fierce battles going on. Then it led to a temporary agreement to
like a truce.
Truce.
Yeah.
But then every now and then you hear that there are individual cases of fightings and
so it's still going on.
Yeah.
There's not been a proper peace settlement. So what's happening is that you've got an enclave of Armenian-speaking people, Christians, inside Azerbaijan, which is a Muslim, Azerbaijani-speaking people. Yeah. How did they get there? Why is that? Why has that happened? Historically, I mean, is it that originally it was all Armenian and then other people invaded, or?
If you see exactly on the map, it's a very strange strategic place, the way it is, as if it has been hidden in a dead end place.
Right.
And but Azerbaijan they wanted to get to that area to expand their lands.
And they have oil, don't they? Baku.
They do.
So they have a lot of support internationally. So it's a difficult problem, isn't it? From my perspective as a peace scholar, it's fascinating, you know. And if I can do anything to help, we can have conferences here at the castle. We can bring historians together to study the history of this. I mean, I've spoken in Moscow. I have contacts with Russian intellectuals, and there is a peace museum, I think, in Baku that I've been in touch with. You know, if we get peace thinkers from Armenian and Azerbaijani traditions, I believe it is possible to solve even these complex problems.
Why not?
You know, through cultural diplomacy, if we get poets from Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan and Armenia, you know, we can solve it at that level, I think. You know, the miraculous level, almost.
Hopefully.
You know, and people like your father, when he's still alive, I'm sure would be doing what he could to get the intellectuals to you know, to make peace with each other. Okay, let's move on and let's talk a bit about your history now, moving on. You ended up in Lebanon, right? Tell me how...
Life in Lebanon was like...
Well, were you born in Lebanon?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's because your parents ended up living there. In all the chaos of the persecution of Armenians, you ended up there. Okay, so what's it like living there in Lebanon?
Well, the Lebanese had been very hospitable towards the Armenians. We even have our church, we have our schools, and they are lenient. We learn Armenian, and we have our cultural life going on. Even our presence in the parliament, we have 7 seats.
Oh right, guaranteed.
Guaranteed.
That's excellent. Yeah. And how many Armenians would you say live in Lebanon?
Nowadays it's roughly around 150,000, whereas before the civil war it was quadruple of that. But then gradually they left. They went to Canada for greener pastures, for better possibilities.
Because of the fighting going on inside Lebanon.
Yep.
Right. Okay. And what? Tell us about that Lebanese civil war. You lived through it as a child or young woman.
Teenager.
What was it like? Okay.
Well, it wasn't easy, you know. Each day was a fight between life and death. But having lived in the west part of Lebanon, where the majority were Muslims, it's not that I faced the persecution that sometimes I read in newspaper, that they were so bad with the Christians. Maybe on in the individual cases, but the way we were treated, we were really, well taken care of.
So you were living inside a largely Muslim part of. Was it in Beirut?
Well, actually, the building we were living in, we had an Armenian, we had a Maronite. We even before the war, we even had Jews living there.
There was a Jewish community in Lebanon. Yeah.
There was a Jewish area.
Right.
They had their synagogue and they lived peacefully. And it was later that they were forced to leave.
It's tragic, isn't it? What's your understanding of why that conflict broke out? What were the various cultural and religious factions in Lebanon causing that war?
Well, the title for the president was chosen to be a Maronite, whereas the number of population in Lebanon, it outnumbered the Muslims. So there came a time that they wanted more rights.
The Muslims?
The Muslims.
Right. And the Muslims are both Sunni and Shia?
And Shia, that's it.
And are there...
And among them they started having even factions.
Between the Sunnis and the Shias? And do they have Alawis, like in Syria? And
not as much, no.
Not as much.
No. But another problem that added on the Lebanese civil war is there were an influx of Palestinians that came to Lebanon.
Right.
And they started getting armed. And it led to further complications in the civil war.
Right, so there was a maelstrom, we would call it in English.
Exactly.
And on a personal level, how did your family cope? Were there bombs going off in your neighbourhood?
We used to hide. We lived on the ground floor, and many of the neighbours from above floors, they used to come and hide, seek refuge for bombs hitting the buildings. And there was, because of the situation we were passing through, we had difficulties with water, with electricity, with food even. You had to. It became a habit because of those days. Now people, when they go shopping, it's a habit that you buy for at least a month. Whereas in other countries, like I witnessed in England, you do your day-to-day shopping. And through that, many times we throw away stuff that we have bought, which is very unwise.
But you stockpile just in case the war starts out again.
Would I?
You stockpile food.
Exactly, yeah. Always there is the fear that any day anything may go wrong. Psychological impact.
Right. But now things, touch wood, are at peace in Lebanon, yeah? That was finished, that war. How do you think that was solved? What was the secret of peace that came to Lebanon?
They signed the Treaty of Taif that things have to cool down, and for a certain period of time everything went back to normal.
Right, and that's held since then. Since then every now and then
assassinations happened, and due to the assassinations, because they didn't know who the culprit was, there were groups fighting each other, revengeful things happening. But we got used. That's the way of life in Lebanon. You hear fighting, the next door somebody is celebrating a birthday or a party.
So life goes on in spite of the fighting.
On and on. This is
I'm right in thinking, am I, that Hezbollah has also got bases in Syria now? Lebanon. Yeah. And this, of course, is why Israel has attacked Lebanon.
True.
Sometimes. And you've lived through all that. Has that impinged on where you live in Beirut? Or?
No. Mainly what's happening there is the borders or the southern suburbs, whereas the rest of the country normally continues its life. Of course, economically it may have its effect, but as far as danger is concerned, I mean, when people read in newspapers, they hear that there's fighting, doesn't mean that life doesn't go on normally in the country.
So how far away from the border with Israel is Beirut?
Around 40 minutes ride.
Which isn't that far. Yeah. So it's also interesting.
Using the highways, of course. If you're by car, it's 1 hour and a half.
Right. I mean, also Lebanon's very important. The coastal region was where the Phoenicians came from.
Right.
And Byblos was one of the towns that you've been there, have you?
Of course.
Yeah.
Byblos is also known as Jbeil, which comes from the Phoenician word Jbelo. And it had a strategic navigation and trades center there. We have Sidon, and the Jbeil falls within the Christian area now.
Okay.
Whereas Sidon and Tyre, they are within the Muslim part. But they have fantastic places for tourists to visit, to see the old architecture.
I mean, I'm interested as a historian of philosophy, the Phoenician contribution to the origin of philosophy in the ancient times. They invented the alphabet that we all use, both the Hebrews and the Arabic and the Christian alphabet and the ancient Greek.
In Tyre, by the way, which is known as, referred to as the rocky area, they also had invented a specific color that they used to dye the dresses. It comes in purple color.
Right.
And it was so expensive that only the rich could afford to have that.
That's the rich deep purple.
It comes from the murex shell.
Right. Interesting.
And we have Baalbek, of course, with its big columns. And there every year we have the Baalbek festival, where they do kind of musical events there.
Interesting. And many of the philosophers of the early pre-Socratic period, like Pythagoras and Thales, they were part Phoenician. Pythagoras, I think, had a Phoenician father, and he was one of the very first philosophers that in the Castle of the Muses here we celebrate their tradition. So, it's a shame that that universality of outlook couldn't prevail. But my reading of Lebanon as a culture, its best, the dream of Lebanon, is that these cultures live together in harmony. There are Christians, there are different types of Muslims.
Druzes, the Armenians, some Kurds even.
And you were saying that originally there was a Jewish community in Lebanon. That must be a very ancient one, going right back in the Ottoman days.
But it was up to the time that I was still a teenager.
So you remember Jews around in Lebanon, It'd be lovely. My vision of the peace process in the Middle East is we can restore that dream of harmony between these different cultures. The purpose of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East is to get the conversation flowing again.
Definitely.
So that each culture can celebrate its difference and realise that there is a transcendental unity that we all come from. There's a divine intelligence behind every culture and civilization, which all the great saints and sages represent. And that we should be fighting for enlightenment for each other, not violence, So let's talk a bit about what's going on in Syria, because you're in Lebanon witnessing this. Are there Armenians in Syria?
Another 150,000. Lebanon, Syria, Cyprus and Egypt, as well as France, had been one of the most richly populated Armenian centers for cultural...
So in Syria there are a lot of Armenians. Have you been there?
I have been there years ago.
Right.
But many are leaving again because of the insecurity.
What do you think's caused this tragic war in Syria? What do the Lebanese papers say about it? What do people on the street in Lebanon say?
What mainly the problem there is they wanted, when there was events happening in the Arab Spring where they wanted to open up and have more freedom, the impact led to the same things happening. It started with a silent demonstration, and later on it led to fighting, getting at a larger scale. Now they are demanding the president to be
so things
restored
polarized,
and the Ba'ath party to be resolved. Yeah.
right? And it's still the Ba'ath party running under Assad in Syria. Yeah. The Ba'ath party, was it active, or is it active in Lebanon?
Slight during the war, not now. You can feel it.
Right. So it wasn't part of Lebanese politics.
Indirectly, maybe not to every individual to feel their presence.
Right, because there's more like a power sharing arrangement in Lebanon and Syria, and I suppose it's this over centralisation of power that people eventually rebel against. Tyrants are always ultimately rejected. So, I mean, one of the projects I've proposed from my institute here is the European Union Mediation Service. I've said, why can't the European Union have official diplomats that could be charged to bring peace in neighbouring countries? So, if the European Union had a mediation service, say, do you think it could help in situations like in Syria, or in the previous Lebanon war and so on?
Yeah, being a neutral force, I think it would be a great idea to go ahead with that.
Right, so I'm going to continue with that and keep
You
prodding the
should.
European Union. Do you have much contact with... There are Armenians throughout the European Union, presumably.
Of course.
You said there's a big body in France, is that right? So presumably they might support the creation of
For
a
sure.
European Union mediation service. It would be in their interests, wouldn't it? And they must be full French citizens,
Yeah.
just of Armenian origin, so they can lobby and work for this, yeah?
We have Marseille, which is highly populated too within France.
And as a people, you suffer genocide, so you must know the costs of not doing anything about
Definitely.
conflict.
Definitely.
So I think I'd like to invite the Armenians of the diaspora throughout the European Union to support this project. And if you want to help liaise, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Surely would.
Yeah, and they must have representatives at the European Parliament as well, do they?
They do.
Did the European Parliament acknowledge the genocide?
Well,
Did they pass a
France,
statement?
France was on its way of doing it, but last minute it pulled back.
So as of now, the European Parliament is still silenced about this, is it? Well, I think we might have to change that. Because, as a historian in the Castle of the Muses, Cleo, the muse of memory and history, and we're having this interview in the room of Cleo, Cleo wants us to remember so we don't repeat the same mistakes, you see.
Sure.
Because as you say, if we silence yesterday's genocide, tomorrow's genocide can happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And reconciliation between people is the best way out.
Yeah, but that has to be based on truth. The point of the Truth and
Trust,
Reconciliation Commission is you can't have false reconciliation. Like the pact between Hitler and Stalin. That was false reconciliation, and Hitler then, reneged on it, invaded the Soviet Union.
True.
There's no honour among thieves, so to say. Truth has to be the basis of real reconciliation. For the Middle East, that's what I think. So this lost history of the Armenians needs acknowledging.
Further.
Yeah. Okay, so yes, I mean, let me just say in terms of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in general in the Middle East, have you come across many peace scholars in Lebanon? Is there a Department of Peace Studies at the universities in Lebanon, Beirut? Do you know anyone who's done teaching of degrees in peace studies and so on? Is it a field you've come across?
No, not to my knowledge, but once I go back, I would be interested to go further, see if there were any that I wasn't well informed of.
Right, because I mean, I'd be very willing to help with any Lebanese scholars or academics, from any background, or because there's the American University of Beirut. What are the other universities in Beirut?
There's the Lebanese University, there is another American university called Lebanese American University.
Right.
And there is, the Armenians even have one called the Hagazian University.
Oh,
where
right.
not only Armenians but Lebanese also attend.
Okay, so well, if any of those universities want help setting up a Department of Peace Studies, or if we could set up one between them all collaborating,
Sure.
we have a thing run from here called the Interfaith and Islamic Middle Eastern Peace Studies Association. So the idea is in Middle Eastern countries to see peace studies departments set up, because there's very few, which is ridiculous. It's a region that needs peace. And how are we going to get peace unless we think it through in detail?
Cooperate.
Because academics love to think, but maybe they're not always thinking about the right things. With using the detailed training that what we have as thinkers. That's why I think we need to be focusing on what peace is. Tell me what the word for peace is in Armenian.
It's a bit long word.
Blimey, how do you spell that? Okay, how do you spell it? In Armenian, tell me the letters in Armenian.
U, To, U, and N.
Right. And what do you know its etymology? Do you know where that comes from, that word?
It comes from the word harar, which means calm.
Calmness. Oh, excellent. I like that. Okay, so that's what we're working for here, is general calmness to descend on these troubled regions. Okay, Hagar.
Harar.
Okay.
It's a difficult word to pronounce.
Sounds like the mother of Ishmael, the Egyptian wife of Abraham. I wonder if there's a connection there. If you had magical powers and could change 3 things in the whole of history, right? Let's say your ancient Armenian gods come back and give you 3 magical powers. What 3 things would you change in the whole of history?
Long time ago I had thought why there should be wars between people. Why it shouldn't be like a game of chess, where they put the map of the country and the minds of 2 strong people, they debate, and this is how they win and lose. Okay.
So sublimate the violence of war into a game of chess.
Not human loss.
Okay. So that's one thing. We'll change wars into chess games. Okay.
Second is to bring tolerance to people, to tolerate each other, to have understanding, compassion, peace and harmony.
That's a big one. Okay. And the third one?
And the third one, not to be vicious. That collective evilness of wanting to be more ambitious, to take more than one needs. To stop that greedy feeling in human beings. Right.
That was Buddha's antidote, wasn't it? Cut down desire, be content with what you have. As much as you can. Yeah, that's what the Druids and all the sages always says. And Gandhi said it,
Precisely.
Not grasping.
Yeah. Because I think the root of evil lies from there.
From the grasping and greed. Yeah. Okay, well, I'd just like to thank you very much. Is there anything in the last few moments of our interview, is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
There is a good quote that I got with me I would like to share with you. It's from one of our writers. His name is William Saroyan.
Okay.
And he had written The Human Comedy. If you don't mind, let me
sure.
read it. He says the following: I should like to see any power of the world destroying the race, this small tribe of unimportant people whose wars have all been forgotten and lost, whose structures have crumbled, literature is unread, music is unheard, prayers are no more answered. Go ahead, destroy Armenians, see if you can do it. Send them into the desert with no water or food, burn their homes, and then see if they will not laugh, sing and pray again. For when two Armenians meet anywhere in the world, see if they will not create a new Armenia.
That's very moving. As long as that love
because
remains.
There is this survival in the Armenians, because they have suffered so many losses throughout centuries. There is kind of resilience in them, and some people, they don't understand that Armenians, why they like intermarriage. They are a bit fanatic. They don't like to marry non-Armenians. But deep down, if you see the psychology, they're trying to protect their own leniences.
Sure, sure. There's also a symbolic significance here because it's Mount Ararat is in the middle of Armenia, isn't it?
And the difficulty for Armenians is from Armenia you can see Ararat, but it's not yours anymore.
Is Ararat in Turkey then, technically? But in Armenia you can look at it.
Yeah.
But it used to be in Armenia.
Yeah.
There's a paradox, isn't there, that Ararat is where Noah's Ark landed, and Noah's Ark symbolises the salvation of the planet from evil and ignorance and violence. The things you asked your magic wand to get rid of caused the flood, in the biblical traditions. And then Noah was said, if you bring in two of everything, which symbolises love, like the passage you just read out, when two people come together, you get a new Armenia, which is like Noah's Ark opening up and we repeople the earth.
Some don't understand when two Armenians get together, if there are foreigners, they naturally tend to talk Armenian, not out of respect to others, but it naturally pours out. And even when you're walking on the road, there are times I look at somebody, I feel that person is Armenian. After talking, I find out, it's the blood that...
Sure, well, it's a kind of telepathy that happens. It's the same if I go abroad, I'll end up talking to, people from Britain. I mean, it's a natural thing. Every tribe, culture loves its own people, its own language. Hebrew people love to talk in Hebrew with each other. Irish do, it's natural. But we also need to affirm our universal identity. And in the Druid tradition, Phineas Farsaith, who came from probably around Armenia, whose ancestors came to eventually settle down in Ireland, brought the knowledge of the original language of mankind. That's the Druid legend, written down by an Irish historian, Geoffrey Keating, that the ancient sacred language before the tribes got split, before the Tower of Babel. And that's the kind of vision of the Institute here. What we're trying to do is work with that primal language, which is the language of the heart.
Incidentally, there's this parallelism between the Stone Age you have here and the Karahungas in Armenia, which are the very same structures. Wonder
like
what's
Stonehenge.
Yes, Stonehenge.
Really? There are like ancient megalithic monuments.
And if you look at the etymology of the word, stone and kar are the same meaning. Kar is stone.
And you call them Karahungas? So Stonehenge, effectively.
Exactly.
Right. There must have been the equivalent of Druids then in ancient Armenia, your priests and priestesses and so on. Well, that's very interesting. So I'd like to thank you, really, on behalf of the Institute for coming on retreat to the Castle of the Muses. Have you enjoyed your time?
And I really enjoyed it, and the daily knowledge that we are sharing between other intellectual people as well as yourself, it's unbelievable. And the vast library you have with its
a severe lack of books on Armenian history, I have to point out.
Well, I'm thinking of sending some to you.
Yeah, we need more work of Armenian historians here.
The way you have organized it, it's
using the Muses as our symbol. Yeah. I'd like to just say, finally, in closing, I mean, we've talked about this, and I'd like to appoint you as our global ambassador from the Institute, going back to Lebanon. Take with you the learning and the vision of peace that you've experienced here, I'm
most grateful.
Let's work with the university sector in Lebanon. Let's try and get them thinking about peace. And then in Armenia proper as well, let's work with Armenian universities and so on. And really get the good news at the end of the day. Because, history is full of tragedy, Holocaust. Melpomene is full as a room with all the bad news. But I believe I'm an optimist, like my mother and my teachers. I believe in human nature. I'm a humanist. I believe, as the Director General of UNESCO says in her call for a new global humanism, she's saying it's the duty of intellectuals and scholars around the planet to put forward the good news. Mankind can make it through these dark days.